Okay, welcome to the third video of our biomass series. We are now going to talk about utilization, or how much of this energy do we use and how do we use it. We're going to first focus on the developing world. So biomass was actually a significant part of the world's energy mix for a long period of time until coal started to dominate, even in just the 1800s. So biomass persists to this day for very low for very basic uses like cooking and heating. In the developing world, where there is lacking access to electricity or natural gas, biomass is used for about 1/3 of energy consumption. In some poorer countries, this can be up to 90%. Biomass accounts for 90% of all energy consumption. All right, and this is direct consumption used specifically for cooking and heating. Okay, in Europe, biomass has always played a bit more of a prominent role than in the United States. Well, it's more diverse in its application. So, for example, Sweden utilizes a lot of forestry. They have 18,000 hectares of willow trees. Like we talked about before, they plant these willow trees very close together, cut them every 3 years, and that's supposed to last for about 20 years before the trees stop growing entirely. So they have this many acres, which amounts to about 30 megawatts of energy from wood chips. Wood chips. Sweden and other Nordic countries also burn a lot of their waste. About 80% of waste is burned. Okay. All right, so that's the developing world and Europe. I haven't talked about other countries like India and China here. India and China, biomass is rapidly going away as those countries develop very, very quickly, and most people now have access to electricity. Okay, the USA. I'm going to write how we know biomass. Corn. Corn is the face of biomass in the United States. There isn't much more that we do for biomass aside from corn. That's because we ferment the corn in order to get ethanol, which is in about 10% of almost all gasoline purchased in the United States. A gasoline cannot burn pure ethanol. There are engines developed to do that, but current cars, the manufacturer standard requires by a certain year it can take up to 10% ethanol. Okay, the problem is that ethanol is subject to two volatile markets, right? So making ethanol is really tricky for two reasons. Number one, you are competing with with petroleum. So right now when gas prices are so low, there is no way ethanol is in any way a cheap alternative. It's much more expensive than gas right now. But to make matters worse, ethanol comes from corn, which is a grain, and the grain market is very volatile and changes almost week to week. So both of these things make ethanol a little bit risky from a financial standpoint. Nonetheless, we persist. We make 15 million gallons per year for the US. Okay, and ethanol has a heat content of about 30 gigajoules per ton, which is pretty good. Okay, so that is corn. That's what biomass in the United States really is all about, is corn, and it's very much related to the automobile industry. Now, as a final note, let's talk about carbon. So a big selling point of biomass is that some people say it is carbon neutral. However, I'm here to tell you that no biomass system is entirely 100% carbon neutral. Let's talk about what that means. Well, the idea is you've got a field, you grow corn in that field. Well, corn is made up of carbon, so CO2 in the atmosphere is actually absorbed into that corn stalk, turned into chemical energy. We then harvest the corn. Here's the little stalks left over. Here's the giant combine. And then after we've harvested the corn, we turn it into ethanol, and then that is burned inside of a vehicle which emits CO2. That CO2 then goes into growing the next round of crops. The idea is that the amount of CO2 going in and coming out is about equivalent or carbon neutral. However, no biomass system is perfectly carbon neutral because energy is used to grow, to produce the crop, plus make the fertilizer a very energy intensive process, etc., etc. And so because this required work, which we currently source using fossil fuels, we put more CO2 into the atmosphere than we cycled. So this amounts to our excess CO2. However, there is no doubt that that biomass is better at sequestering carbon or hiding carbon. See how this CO2, which in the atmosphere would increase global warming, in a corn stalk, it does nothing to global warming, to climate change. And so it's better to have it in that corn stalk temporarily. So it is better for carbon purposes. Just as an idea, I have a little list here for emissions from certain energy sources in grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Oops. Okay, so energy crops, things like corn, etc., end up producing about 14. And then something like straw or kind of dried grass is 13. Contrast that with natural gas, which emits 446 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So we're talking more than a tenfold difference. It's more like it is a huge difference between how much carbon is actually generated and creating and then using energy crops versus how much carbon is generated and creating and using natural gas. Even worse is coal, remember, which is half burned, 955 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So this is why coal is going away. It yields less energy and creates more carbon than natural gas. And this is why biomass very much plays a part in our energy future, because at least now it is not carbon neutral, but it is very, very close. All right, that's it for utilization of biomass and for our biomass portion of this class.